Growing up in Brooklyn, New York, I was literally 4 years old when I started doing drugs. I remembered watching my older brother shooting heroin downstairs in our basement, and I asked him if I could try it too. He told me, "No way, you're just a child. You're not old enough." Here's where things get weird. Though I was too young to even realize what I would soon experience was undeniably paranormal. I obviously had no idea what drugs were at just 4 years old, except for what I assumed was just something that everybody does, not realizing the self-destructive nature down a road of real spiritual darkness that such things entail. Shortly after he turned me down, I heard a voice in my head saying, "You don't have to listen to him. I'll show you how to do it." I thought nothing unusual about the voice. I just went along with what it told me to do. In real time, I heard it say, "Go into the kitchen, pull a chair up to the stove, and turn on the burner. These are the things that you'll need." I followed every last instruction the voice told me, right down to the letter. Before long, I was doing drugs and getting high every day like a regular junkie at just 4 years old. When I was 6, that's when I started smoking weed. By the time I was 10, my older brother gave me cocaine and said I was finally old enough. He showed me how to do everything a young boy my age should have no business doing. My family was into Voodoo, a type of magic that has its roots originating in Haiti. I had also met a Voodoo priestess from Haiti that lived right there in Brooklyn. Brooklyn was her territory, so to speak, because during that time, it was considered a code of respect among witches to not overlap their territories. The idea was that there were enough customers for everyone. She ran a shady business, sometimes pretending to be a healthcare professional. She would cast spells for her clients, so they would gain love, money, and power, which were few among other things. But of course, there was always a price. She worked under my father in a local church, presenting herself under the guise of a church evangelist representative, which mostly everyone who had connections associated with the church knew of her as such. She would orchestrate church meetings at our house. Women whose husbands had left them in divorce had gathered in those meetings, and she would formulate potions for them to get their husbands back. She either had a fetish item, or a juju, or a potion for just about any problem, and she started teaching me her craft. She once told me that I was the 7th child of the Voodoo priest, and that I was chosen. She also said that I was supposed to be taught and trained in these magical arts, so I could be a worthy servant under Papa Doc Duvalier at his palace in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. At the time, I didn't understand what any of that meant, but it'll all make sense as I explain my experiences growing up from my youth. My great-great-grandfather, who was a slave owner, came from Ireland. He traveled to an island of the Caribbean called Hispaniola, which was one country. The east region of the island is the Dominican Republic, which is the majority of the land, and the west minor region is Haiti. Haiti was where he settled and bought a plantation along with a good handful of slaves. Slavery was a very lucrative business during those times. One of his slaves went by the name Pinky, who was my great-great-great-grandmother, and also one of his relatives. One day, his immediate family fell gravely ill, and during that season, all his crops gradually started dying, for there was a curse placed on his family and his land by some of his own slaves. No longer able to make a living in Haiti, he then traveled to Dallas, Texas with his remaining 5 slaves, Pinky being among them. A couple generations later, my father was born in 1917. My father married my mother in 1946, and they moved to New York. They had 6 children and one on the way, but my father did not want any more kids. My mother, pregnant with me at the time, told my father she wasn't going to get rid of her child. My father said, "Yes, you are." He had beforehand set up an appointment at a back alley abortion clinic for her, which was close to a famous university on the East Coast. When my mother further verbally objected to his demands, he beat her, kicking her in her stomach to try to force a miscarriage. He then forcibly dragged her and threw her in the car, then drove to the abortion clinic where she was taken by strong men that put restraints on her. The nurses with their instruments attempted to destroy me and tear me apart from inside my mother, but somehow they were unable to succeed. They then proceeded to forcibly drug my mother with pills, as well as needles, so that I would be killed intravenously or internally. They literally worked on her for hours, but got nowhere. I remember my mother telling me that she could feel a spiritual barrier inside her, and it was around me, and there was absolutely nothing the nurses could do to penetrate it to get to me. She could sense me being protected. After so long, the nurses eventually gave up because they knew that if they continued to work, they would end up killing my mother. That's precisely what they told my father, who then decided that her death simply wasn't worth it. So I lived. Bringing it all back to where the story left off, I was around 11, being an apprentice under that voodoo priestess. My father was also a voodoo priest, and they worked in our local church. I was taught many types of love potions and their uses. Also different subversive magical tactics, like slowing down someone's business or making it fail completely. I was also taught different charm spells to influence people in my favor, as well as more sinister shit like something called pavor nocturnus, which is Latin for sleep terror or night terror. Its meaning is pretty self-explanatory. It feeds into another facet she called nemos, meaning illness or disease, or vicious spiral, where a person can't seem to get past a problem, and they keep coming back to you for different solutions. And when you give them a solution, something else goes wrong. This sinister spell was one she used often for her business. She told me if I knew how to keep someone in nemos, I would never be broke, because the more they pay you to get the spell off them, the more they get wrapped into the spell, never noticing the vicious spiral for what it is. And they keep coming back like a zombie. She was very much into control and manipulation to keep people bound to her services. Earlier, I had mentioned that she used to pretend to be a healthcare professional, and she would use witchcraft to get away with it. When her patients came with a particular ailment, she was able to alleviate it completely. However, the pain would simply re-emerge in a different location in the patient's body. For example, if the ailment was in the patient's chest, she could relieve the discomfort in that area, but it would later show up in the patient's left knee, literally. All she did was shift the pain from one spot to another with an effigy that had a psychic link to the patient. She even used the same dark manipulative spells previously mentioned to keep them coming back, and she would charge her patients heavily. Many of those same patients attended our church, and she would often tell them, "Oh, isn't God good?" Or she would say things like, "Hallelujah, praise Jesus." Nobody knew that this woman was a manipulative, two-faced witch pretending to be a holy church-going saint and a religious leader. Typical days being trained under her, I would often go up and down the stairs in her shop, bringing her different supplies like potions or oils and juju pouches, and women would pay her money in exchange. Right before my eyes, those same divorced women had their husbands or boyfriends return to them time and time again, as they would show up with their husbands in our shop, and I knew it was witchcraft. One day I had noticed she would always sit with this creepy-looking doll the size of a child's play figure counterpart. It had a pale face with pinkish cheek blush, wore a thick long-sleeve dress that was a solid deep red with vertical wells and white wrist cuffs, rose lips, large earth-brown eyes with black lashes, black eyeliner, and long curly dark brown parted hair in pigtails adorned with a dark lavender purple bow on top. Shoes the same solid deep red matched the dress. She would talk to it, having full-on conversations about God knows what, for like more than half an hour sometimes. This started to make me afraid of her, because I didn't know what to think, like she must be on some psych ward shit. But what truly terrified me to my soul was when I heard that thing talk back. I remember so desperately not wanting to believe what I had heard at first. But then I heard it again, in a sort of guttural, unusual voice that sounded demonic. What confirmed it was when I saw its mouth moving those dark rose lips with an expressionless face, uttering that terrifying voice, and she wasn't even touching it. She was sitting in a chair, and the doll was facing her on a shelf. Whenever she got up and walked somewhere else and said something to it, the doll's head would spin to face her in response. And it was not battery-powered at all. To say the least, I was astonished in utter shock and traumatized the rest of the day. I had nightmares about that doll. What I found out was that the doll would tell her the names of all the people that would be visiting her shop or her clinic on any given day, and discuss all their problems in perfect details so that she could prepare for them. She liked to call herself a prophet of God, which is like a seer or a fortune teller, except the person gifted with the ability is Christian, and their ability is purely God-given. She held her church meetings and would say, "Praise the Lord, everybody," and the whole crowd of women would respond in like manner. She would then proceed to point out specific individuals at random and describe all their problems and personal situations in precise detail to the T. She would always claim that the Lord revealed these details to her, but every moment she spoke, I could hear that little creepy doll's voice in my memory, reciting word for word, as though it were synchronized with her voice, just as she was repeating those same words spoken to her by the doll. I would always watch the astonishment on the women's faces as they were beguiled into believing that the voodoo priestess was a prophet of God. Right after her so-called prophecies, as she would call it, she collected large sums of money that all the women would pay up front to receive different potions, oils, or tinctures, or even powders, for all the different problems and situations for each individual, along with their instructions, which I knew had been provided by that demonic doll the voodoo priestess had spoken to, but she would call it a blessing from the Lord. She would always tell them, "Come and receive your blessing." She finessed them for every dime, making her monthly sales skyrocket, though all through the workings of that dark witchcraft spell, Nemos. One particular time, the voodoo priestess had set up all her paraphernalia and fetish items inside the room where I stayed. As I was sleeping one night, I suddenly felt my bed shaking violently. I lay there petrified in complete darkness. This would occur every few minutes and lasted for numerous seconds that felt like an eternity. Sweat began to seep from my pores, and my heart was racing. I had no idea what was happening. Eventually, I built up the courage to sit up and switch on the side lamp. Absolute silence permeated the whole room, and everything was totally still. I don't know what gave me the idea, let alone the courage to do what I did next, but slowly I got up and crept down to look under the bed, and what I saw was like something out of a nightmare. But I was wide awake. What I'll describe isn't something that's easy to believe, because I experienced this alone. Under my bed, I saw my father looking back at me. Well, what looked like my father at least, except his face held a grim expression. His skin was a sickly green, with a sinister hue that gave a slight glow. His eyes were darkened and sunken in, and he was smiling creepily with the most evil grin I've ever seen from ear to ear. His teeth were grotesque and rotting, but they were long and pointed like needles, as the likeness of a monster. He started coming towards me slowly. I scooted away on the floor until I was against the wall. Slowly yet gradually he emerged completely from under the bed, still smiling with that sinister grin. That's when I noticed his lower half. He had no legs, except for one long abdomen covered in green scales, with a big long fin at the end, like a fish. His arms also green and scaly. I was like a cornered mouse, terrified beyond words. I heard him bellow a deep guttural laugh that sounded completely inhuman and otherworldly. Then he sprang up and dove right through the floor. I just sat there shaking in terror. Then, just moments later, I heard some commotion coming from the direction of the closet. I crept slowly towards it. Then I realized it was coming from inside the closet. Slowly yet surely, I crept closer, and then inched the door open that was slightly ajar. At first, I noticed nothing, but when I looked down, I saw like 3 tiny gremlin creatures running around. They were chasing each other, no more than 6 inches tall, with tails and green skin that was glowing, beady red eyes and pointed ears. They were playing around on the closet floor, screeching almost like angry rats. Then they all ran right through the closet wall like phantoms. I literally stayed awake the remainder of that night, too scared and perplexed to sleep. On a different night, I lay in bed to sleep. I heard a voice calling my name, dead in the middle of the night. Curtis, Curtis, get up, go to the closet. Still half asleep, I went along with the commands, not fully coherent, nor did I realize what I was doing. It was as if I was simply obeying my mother in my tired stupor. Slowly I sat up and got out of bed, then made my way over to the closet as the voice continued to speak. Go inside and close the door. I went into the closet and shut the door. Initially, I had to make room for myself moving clothes around, as it was pretty stuffy in there to begin with. But then, I realized it was pitch black, especially with the door shut completely. I was a little unnerved by the darkness, still not fully comprehending what made me go in there. I just sat down on the floor. Then, I felt a horrible presence. It was terrifying, and I knew it was evil. I heard the voice say, "Join us and give us your whole self. You will be one of our top agents. How about it? Come work for us." I responded, "What do you mean?" Immediately after I asked that question, all the clothes and other items that were next to me suddenly vanished. Even the wall I was leaning on was gone. There was no floor. I was in a black abyss. Pure thick darkness extended infinitely in all directions, like I was in the vacuum of space. I looked around, feeling smothered by the thick darkness. It was a darkness that I could feel. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. But then I noticed a very dim, minuscule speck of blue light out of the corner of my eye, like the point of a needle. It was so tiny and dim that it would have been completely unnoticeable if it wasn't for the vast solid blackness all around that made it stand out slightly. Though it was hard for my mind to fathom, intuitively, I knew that this tiny speck of light was the Earth. I was deep in the vacuum of space. How did I get here? As young as I was then, I had no understanding of what I had experienced, but knowing what I know now in retrospect, I realized that my spiritual body must have been projected off the Earth out into this vast empty abyss. Still completely saturated by that horrible presence, in absolute darkness, I felt something approaching closer. Then I heard that voice again, resounding and encompassing from every direction. You can have anything, what you've ever desired that was out of your reach, whatever you've longed for. Do you want money, abundance of riches, sex, any girl you've ever fantasized about? We'll make you a megastar, an icon among men. You will be given many talents like music, art, and power of influence over everyone, men and women. All of them will be yours for you to do with as you please and satisfy any desire, so long as you say these words. As I was listening and taking in the words from this voice, that's when I started to see what was speaking to me. A large face was before me. It was horrendous, frightening, and repulsive beyond words. Huge glowing red eyes with vertical serpent-like slits were fixed on me, and thick horns were coming out of its head. It was the size of a large building, and it was more demonic looking than anything I've ever imagined beyond my wildest dreams. That face was absolutely nightmarish. Strangely enough, I was getting numb to the hideousness of that face as I started getting visions of myself in positions of power and fame. I saw myself with lavish things I've never dreamed of having, and with other famous rich people. I even found myself in different places of astonishing splendor and beauty. I was also surrounded by multitudes of gorgeous women. They all flocked to me like moths to a light. I noticed myself growing ecstatic with excitement as these visions continued flooding in through my mind more and more rapidly. I heard the voice say, "Just repeat these words, and it will be official." The words mentioned formed the basic simple phrase of confirmation, one easy sentence verbalized, in my induction into whatever this was would be set in stone. I won't repeat the exact words here in case anyone is tempted to try this and put themselves in harm's way. By that point, I was totally overwhelmed with excitement, so much so that I felt a frustrating urgency out of sheer impatience for this voice to finally get on with the words for me to say. With sheer enthusiasm, I eagerly began repeating word for word as the voice instructed me. Halfway through the sentence, I felt something like a subtle faint feeling that was just off. It was strange, like it was an extremely faint whisper from very far away. It was like a gnat was whispering in my ear, and I could feel an expression of distress and desperation. I continued repeating the words as my excitement was still rolling like a train speeding downhill. I was almost finished with just 2 more words left before the sentence would be completed when I got that strange feeling again. This time, I was able to make out words, and the words were desperately pleading for me to stop, like the whispers of a gnat. I heard, "Stop! Stop now, Curtis! Please don't finish the sentence." And just like that, I stopped. I did not complete the sentence. Then I heard the demonic face repeat the last two words once more after it had spoken them the first time for me to finish the sentence. But I said nothing. It called my name. Curtis, finish the sentence. I didn't speak. Again, it spoke. Curtis, what's wrong? I said. I changed my mind. I don't want to anymore. This demonic entity raged. It shouted. What do you mean you changed your mind? Are you mad? You will have everything this world has to offer, and more. Don't be a fool. This is your last chance. The offer is still on the table. Take it. Repeat the sentence. The soft voice spoke to my conscience once more, saying, Don't do it. Say no. I said, no. Instantly, I was back inside the closet with stuff and clothes around me. And that horrible evil presence was completely gone. The darkness inside the closet compared to where I just came from was like night and day. It was nothing compared to that black abyss. My father, who was a voodoo priest, practiced a spiritual art called astral projection, which allows the practitioner's astral body to leave out of their physical body and relocate in a different place or dimension. When tied in with certain occult workings and rituals, sometimes even their physical body can levitate and travel to anywhere in the world with the power of certain spirits. My father had many friends in positions of power within our community. On many nights, they would all gather at our house to hold certain parties that would last all night long. My father was one of the ringleaders of these gatherings. Whenever I would hear the commotion downstairs, I crept out of my bedroom as silently as I possibly could, avoiding all the creaks in the floor. Despite my best efforts to stay unnoticed, I would always hear a few people in the conglomeration of noise whisper, "Here he comes, here he comes." After that, most of the noise immediately died down. When I took a peek downstairs through the railings, I literally saw people exiting through the walls like phantoms, until all downstairs was completely empty and silent. I always heard the clamorous commotion gradually build back up after I went back to my room, and whenever I crept back out, the exact same thing would always happen again. I became truly aware of how powerful and deadly evil curses can be ever since I was just a small child. I was walking down the street in the projects, and I overheard an argument behind a crowd of onlookers I saw around the corner. I could tell it was a heated argument, but as I got closer, I could tell that one of the people arguing was my own grandmother. I didn't know exactly what she was saying, but whoever it was to, I knew she was tearing them a new one. I was barely able to see what was happening through the crowd, but I still kept my distance, because I was always told to stay out of grown folks' business. Eventually, I could see that she was arguing with a man. I had never seen that man before, and I was familiar with just about everyone on our block, so I assumed he must have been from some other district and was making himself a little too comfortable in our part of town. Or maybe he tried to steal something or cheat someone out of money, and he ended up getting into it with my grandmother. As they were going back and forth, the argument was becoming increasingly fierce. Although my grandmother was small in stature, she did not back down from this man. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I heard my grandmother bark some type of phrase, which I will not repeat here in case someone is tempted to try this and put themselves in harm's way. She then did a gesture with her hand, and that man instantly fell backwards, then landed with a thud like dead weight, eyes still open, but completely expressionless, and not budging like he was dead. It literally took me what seemed like almost a whole hour to process what I had just seen. Was that man really dead? Had I just seen my grandmother kill someone on the spot with just a simple hand gesture? That's when I secretly decided to do a little experiment of my own. I remembered that phrase my grandmother had worded in the hand gesture she did, and I repeated them myself. Out of nowhere, this smoke appeared out of the blue, and it started spinning around me. It was spinning faster and faster like a cyclone until it enveloped me. Then it went into my mouth and into my chest. Now I was absolutely terrified. What had I done? I felt it continuously spinning inside me. I just ran straight home. I remember startling my siblings in an absolute panic, telling them there was something inside me, and I couldn't get it out. It made me feel even worse and angry when I saw that they presumed I was joking around, but I just couldn't get through to them how serious I was. My uncle, although he was a drunkard, had always been my hero and a father figure to me, and I've always had great respect for him even to this day. He was laying down, and I went over to lay next to him because I saw him as my protector and my friend. Later in the night, I felt the spinning sensation happening inside my chest again, and I yelled out to my uncle, "Uncle! Uncle! Wake up! Something's happening to me!" He said, "What's wrong, nephew?" I said, "Something's spinning inside me, and I don't know how to get it out." The next moment was an experience that was out of a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. As I was sitting there panicking and dry heaving with that sensation in my chest, the closet door opened up, and there stood towering over me this absolutely horrific monster with wings, large horns, and red glowing eyes piercing into my soul. Its presence was petrifying. I tried to make my way over to my uncle so he could protect me. But before I could get any closer, that horrendous monster put its foot down on my arm, and I couldn't move. It felt like the weight of a house was on my arm, crushing my bones, and I screamed with everything in my soul from the pain and the absolute terror. Although this was a horrific and traumatic experience I will never forget, I really don't remember much after that. I guess whatever I experienced was so traumatic that my mind just blocked it out. But as I grew older, I became a wicked person. All the kids in my neighborhood were afraid of me because I had powers from different spirits I had worked with. People I hated were killed in freak accidents, as well as anyone who tried to mess with me. I was sort of isolated in a way, because whenever I would come to play with the other kids, they would always go inside immediately because they were afraid of me. Even the adults would not let their kids play with me. When it came to performing evil curses, I never hesitated to use them on anyone who got in my way, even my own friends. I used to know these boys who were known as the Davis brothers. They were some of few others I would always hang with in the streets around our block to do business with, as well as other illegal activities. One day, they had attended a revival meeting. And long story short, they became Christians and no longer hung out with us in the streets entertaining heathenistic affairs. At the time, I had a very negative regard for the church and church folks. I always thought they were weak moral pacifists and too dumb to recognize when they're being taken advantage of, based on my own experiences with the voodoo priestess. Out in the streets, we were warriors and juvenile delinquents, and it rubbed me the wrong way how our fellow crew would abandon us, leaving our paradigm to basically become Jesus freaks. It especially got to me when they came back around attempting to preach and convert our other friends. They told us to stop selling drugs and turn from violence and give our hearts to Jesus. In my mind, I thought if my other friends became Christians, I would have to run business by myself and lose customers. That's when I made up in my mind that I would put a curse on them. That night, I summoned a demon, and it came up from out of the ground. I gave it clear, specific instructions to go terrorize those boys. I told this demonic spirit to torment them day and night, disrupt their sleep, and cause accidents to happen to them until they lose their faith in God. Then away the demon went on its mission. But not too long after, the demon came back to me and said, "There's nothing I can do because they're protected." I got angry and said, "What did I tell you to do?" I said go mess them up and torment them continuously. Now go. Away the evil spirit went once more. Shortly after, the demon returned back to me and said, "I told you, I can't do anything to them. They're protected." I was furious and told it to get lost. This time, I summoned an even bigger and stronger demon. I instructed it to go torment those boys day and night, give them nightmares, destroy their families, total their cars, set their houses on fire, and ruin their faith in God. After a few days, that demon I had sent after them came back to me, and I inquired, "Did you do what I told you to do?" The demon said, "I can't touch them, just like the one you sent before me said. You can't touch them. They're protected." So I angrily dismissed the demon and decided that I needed to see what was going on for myself. I lay in bed and employed the same spiritual technique called astral projection I had mentioned before. I came out of my body and I traveled to their home, and what I found astonished me. I saw these beings of light shining like the sun. They were taller than the house and massive with a formidable stature. They were wearing shining armor and holding long flaming swords like they were going to war. The swords they were wielding could have easily been at least 10 feet long, and they were on fire. I swore there could have easily been at least 10 of these entities circumventing about within the proximity of the house, and they were encompassed by a brilliant light that enveloped the entire complex and the community. I said to myself, no wonder the demons I sent could not go near them. That's when I knew for a fact that I had no chance of challenging these formidable beings. So I went back home to my body. I had resented those brothers ever since they abandoned our group, but I was also intrigued by the power that they walked with daily, which is ultimately what made me develop an open mind to the things they told us. What really did it for me was how I observed the way they were living. They seemed to be always doing well for themselves. They were never in any serious trouble. They were always smiling, like they had no serious worries, despite that they grew up in the same impoverished environment as I did. And for those who attempted to harm them or plot against the brothers, something always went wrong. Like they would always get caught in their own trap and fall victim to their own plot. The brothers were feared for that very reason. No one could touch them. They were protected by a mysterious force. My reservations and contempt for them had gradually diminished completely, and I decided that I would join them because I wanted to experience that self-assurance, completeness, and protection I had envied, and at the same time admired about the brothers. I was tired of people stealing from me, getting into fights, and engaging in conflicts in the streets. I was also tired of the uncertainty of whether I would die or end up in prison by the life I was leading. Yet consequently, it almost happened. I was heavily into dealing with drugs since I was 4, and I had developed an inner genius when it came to concocting various kinds of combinations for specific effects. And that same voice that spoke to me when I was 4 had always been with me, teaching me many things when it came to drugs. I remember I was working on a completely brand new composure that had never been done, so I could gain the respect and authority for manufacturing this new product when I put it out in the streets. I was receiving instructions and ideas from that same voice, telling me which substances to combine down to their proportions. So I started testing this new product when I was sure I had gotten everything just right. And I got high like I've never been in my life. I was on cloud 9. That same evening, I had ended up at a bar with some of my buddies because somehow I needed just one glass of beer to complete this high, as odd as that sounds. The bartender said to me, "You're either gonna drink or go home." And sure enough, he gave me a glass of beer, despite that I was well underage. That's when I overdosed. My friends had to drag me into their car, but they weren't taking me to the hospital because none of them wanted to risk getting in trouble with the police, so they were going to take me home. While we were in the car, I began to lose consciousness. I had died. What I experienced was more horrific than any nightmare I've ever had in my life. I went to a dark place, and I was being taken by demons. I saw things that were so horrific, I could never begin to put into words even if I tried. No words could ever do justice. It was terror untold. They started torturing me as I began screaming, but I couldn't hear myself because there was nothing but screams of misery, so loud like blasting sirens in every direction, continuously, non-stop, blood-curdling shouting. I was completely massacred and ripped and shredded in pieces. Then somehow, after an indiscernible amount of time, these amazing brilliant hands of light rescued me from that nightmarish pit of non-stop madness and darkness. Numerous inhuman hands, jet black with talons and scales, grabbed at my legs like it was a tug of war, saying, "He belongs to us," as I was pulled out of that horrible place. Then I heard another voice that was as a pleasant melody saying, "Because of your mother's prayers, you have been restored." I was back in my body inside the speeding car. I was so messed up from the drugs that my friends had to drag me out of the car and leave me in front of my mom's house. Then they sped off. I couldn't walk at all. It took all my strength to drag myself up the stairs. I almost passed out again. My sister found me laid out in front of the door and immediately knew I had overdosed. Sometime after I had recovered from my drug overdose, I was still stubbornly stuck in my ways, despite experiencing what I had experienced. My sister was a Christian and told me that I needed to be saved, and she planned on bringing me to a church revival despite my reluctance. I was still involved with selling drugs, and I was informed that there was a big shipment coming to our block. If I worked this deal through, my share would be $1 million. I was also dating this girl named San, who knew me from what I was involved with, and she knew about this deal that I was in, including the $1 million cut I was promised. She told me, "You can't go to church, you have an appointment." I was the main agent who cut the products into proportionate shares when our shipment came in, and I was promised $1 million, but I would be in some serious trouble with these drug dealers if I didn't show. San made promises of all the sex I could ever want if I spoiled her with my share of money. However, I promised my sister I would go with her to the revival on Sunday. And even though I did not want to go, promises are what I've always stayed true to. My girlfriend San said to me, "You can't get saved. I'll make sure you don't. You need this money." But I was like, what makes you think I'll get saved? So that following Sunday, my sister took me to the church revival, and I wanted to sit in the back because I did not like church people. At some point, midway through the celebration, When they were having the altar call, the pastor looked directly at me, sitting all the way in the back through the hundreds of other people around. Somehow, that was the exact same time my girlfriend actually came there at the revival to get me. She was standing there at the door threshold calling me in a low tone saying, "Curtis, let's go. The truck is almost here." She was referring to the large semi-truck that was bringing all the drugs and other products. There she was calling me, and the pastor was looking directly at me, and then pointed. He said in his bold voice full of bass, "You, young man in the back, come up here to the altar." My girlfriend was still calling to me, saying, "Come here, don't you go up there." At the time, I was still severely messed up from the drug overdose, and I couldn't walk without assistance. But miraculously in that moment, I was able to pull myself to my feet and walk straight to the pulpit unassisted. As I was making my way forward, I could hear that same voice speaking to me since I was 4 years old, saying, "Don't go up there. You don't need these church freaks or anything they have to offer. You go up there and you'll lose out on all that money. Then we're gonna come kill you." Then I heard that other voice, which I immediately recognized as the one that told me how my mother's prayers saved me from death. It said to me, "I love you." And it told me about all of my close calls with death I had experienced throughout my life, how I was spared from an eternity of unspeakable endless suffering and torment in that unimaginable nightmare I had experienced. I knew this voice was Jesus speaking to me, telling me that God saved me from death so many times, how guns got jammed preventing the bullet from blowing my brains out, how God stopped traffic when I was thrown from a speeding car at 50 miles per hour, and how the nurses were prevented from killing me when I was inside my mother's womb at the abortion clinic. While all these things were being spoken to me, I started getting emotional on my way to the pulpit. Since my youth, I've been severely abused throughout my life, far worse than anything I've written here. I was a mean, stone-cold hardened criminal and an occultist at just 15 years old, and me being this emotional was something completely new for me. The amount of unconditional love I felt from Jesus' voice speaking to me, I did not feel like I deserved. The first thing the pastor said to me was, "You are a sorcerer, and the Lord wants to turn your life around if you would accept Him into your heart." I thought to myself, I don't know what you want from me. All I know is crime, voodoo, and witchcraft. How can God use me? Then I was given a vision, traveling all over the world to be a blessing to many, and spreading God's love through my own experiences, and how I was delivered from a life of crime and evil. My girlfriend was in the background literally screaming for me to come back. But my full attention was taken by Jesus' presence and the pastor ministering to me. That moment, on December 15th, 1971, I gave my life to Jesus. My sister told me that God would remove every one of those drug dealers from my life, and none of them would be able to harm me. I did not go to that drug deal, and I never returned to that life again. Sure enough, every one of those drug lords and dealers imploded on each other. All of them were murdered, just like my sister said. And as far as Sand is concerned, I haven't seen or heard from her since. In retrospect, I'm certain she was being used by the demons in my life to keep me stuck in that life of crime. And Jesus delivered me from all of it.